Welcome. Today we're going to discuss the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln, one of the greatest speeches in history. And we're going to look at what it can teach us both about effective writing and about critical reading. Some of the key points we're going to address in this lesson are how to address audiences, how to use and read allusions, which, allusions, that is not the same thing as illusions. All right? We're not talking about this. This is something you see that's not real. An allusion, allusion, is a reference to some aspect of culture. So we're going to look at how writers use allusions when they write, and how critics elaborate on allusions when they analyze a work critically. We're also going to look at how to read critically. We're going to look at how to write a lot about a little, and we're going to learn how to write a lot in a little. Okay? Meaning that this is one of the greatest speeches in history, and it's only about 350 words long. It's not that long. So when your teacher tells you to write, a 300-word discussion post or a 500-word essay, that's not a lot of space, but if you write well, you can write a lot in that amount of words. And you can really include a lot of information if you craft your words just right. At the same time, your teacher might assign you a lesson where you have to critically analyze a short passage. And you say, well, how can I write a lot about that little passage? Well, we're going to discuss how you can write a lot about a little, because if something's well written, it packs a lot of information into a small amount of space. And in the process of all this, I'm going to give you 3 sample essays that you could write about the Gettysburg Address. All right, we're going to cover 3 topics that we could write a 5-paragraph essay on. Okay, so first off, let's talk about the historical context of the speech. All right, and now I know what's in your mind. Why is he talking about history in the English class? It all connects. Okay, this is the reason why you study so many subjects is they all connect to one another. So we're talking about the speech as it's written, but in order to do that, you have to understand the historical context in which it's written and what he's talking about, which is how you help understand the audiences. So, first question. We know that this is being given in the middle of the Civil War. It's 1863. All right? Up till now, who has been winning the war? Would anybody like to suggest who's been winning the Civil War up till now? Yes.
The South?
Yes, the South has been winning the war up till now. Okay, the North has just won its first major victory at Gettysburg. All right, so Lincoln is giving the speech to kind of rally support, and we're going to get back to that in a little bit. But Lincoln's giving the speech to rally support. He's dedicating this battlefield as a monument to the dead. All right, there's 2 things going on. He's dedicating it as a national monument, and he's dedicating it as a cemetery. When do you normally build a monument for a war? When do you normally build a war memorial or a monument? Do you normally build it during the war? No, you build it after the war. Okay, the Arch de Triomphe in Paris is not the arch to a war we just started winning. So Lincoln's doing something kind of unusual here. He's dedicating a memorial to a war he's just started winning. He's also dedicating a national cemetery. This is the first United States national cemetery. Why might there be a problem in the United States with having a national cemetery? Think about it. What principle in our society might kind of have an issue with the national cemetery idea? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The First Amendment. Okay, a cemetery is normally thought of as a religious place. Okay, you Highlander fans out there, a cemetery is sacred ground, right? So a national cemetery is going to be sacred ground. So you can't. So he's doing something that could be interpreted as religious. And believe it or not, back in the 1850s and 60s, they were having pretty much the same arguments about their society as we do today. There were moral issues that some citizens were concerned about, that they wanted government to enforce what they believed to be the moral thing on everybody. And then other citizens who felt that those people were violating the First Amendment by trying to force their morality on other people. There were great debates going on about what the role of religion in public life should be. I mean, those debates go back to the founding fathers themselves. For example, Thomas Jefferson's infamous letter saying that there should be a wall of separation of church and state, where others of the founding fathers believed that religion should play a very prominent role in public life, just that the government should not favor a particular religion, but that, George Washington said that the religion should be, people should actively present their religious beliefs in public. So the same debates went on among the founding fathers. They go on today. They went on then. So Lincoln is engaged in the Civil War. He's just started winning it. He's dedicating a national cemetery, which could be interpreted as a religious action. He's dedicating a national cemetery, which is a monument to the war, in the middle of the war, because he's trying to gain support for the war effort. And he's got a lot of different issues he's dealing with. And let's talk about some of those issues besides what I've already mentioned. Why is the Civil War being fought? Here's a trick question for you. Why is the Civil War being fought? I'm sure you're all going to give what most people consider the obvious answer.
To preserve the Union?
Preserve the Union, why? What are they fighting over?
Slavery?
No.
Succession?
They're not fighting over slavery per se. They're fighting over states' rights. Whether the Union is more important or whether the self-determination of states are more important. Slavery just happens to be the issue that catalyzed this conflict. Again, because some people thought that slavery was immoral and were trying to say that it should be outlawed, and other people who thought that slavery should be a matter of individual choice. So, and that the states should make the decision. So Lincoln had been elected with the promise to outlaw slavery, and the southern states had exercised what they believed to be their right to secede, and we're going to get back to that in a little bit. Let's talk about the speech itself. Hopefully you have a copy of it in front of you. fourscore years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived or so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Okay, I'll give you a second to applaud. Now, let's talk about this speech, and I'm going to start from the middle. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here. Is that statement objectively true in retrospect?
No.
No. We're talking about this speech today, over 150 years after it was given. We remember what's happened there. We remember what he said there. Does Lincoln want the statement to be true? No. This whole event is a PR stunt. Okay, he's trying to rally support for the war effort. He's trying to get the people, the citizens, to build up their morale because they've been losing, and he wants to emphasize that we're winning. He wants to get the troops' morale up. He wants to get international support. He wants the world to note, and he wants the world to remember what he's saying here. It's a typical strategy of politicians to fake humility. Okay. All right. So that's an important point to pay attention to. Now, let's talk about those issues we addressed. First Amendment, okay? What do people say today about the role of religion in public life, right? There's some people who say, again, that religion should be more prominent in public life. Some people who want religion to be limited to worship services and private prayer and, have no role in public life. So Lincoln one of the main things Lincoln is addressing in this speech is those two extremes and everybody in between. Okay, there's some people over here who say, by dedicating this cemetery, you're violating the First Amendment. And then there's other people over here who are saying, by calling it just a dedication and not calling it a consecration, you're taking away from the religious significance of the event. You're lying. You should make it an outright consecration and make it sacred ground. And you're just calling it a dedication of a national cemetery. You should, So some people who think we're more pro-religion may not think it's a religious enough event, and some other people may think it's too religious an event. And then there's the people who will say, well, you're just trying to get political capital on the deaths of soldiers, which people often say in wartime, which I think is kind of silly because the whole point of a war is to get political capital on the death of the soldiers. All right. So Lincoln addresses these audiences, and he kind of builds up to it, but he really just does it in one sentence. And this is going to be the first of our outlines, okay? He uses a technique. He uses it twice, and it's a very interesting rhetorical technique. It's a basic rule of rhetoric that you should repeat key points 3 times. You'll often hear in speeches the person will keep going back to the main point over and over again because they want you to remember it, all right? Think about your classic fairy tales. Classic thing in fairy tales is for things to happen in 3s. For some reason, we remember things better in 3s. So Lincoln does that. But he tricks us. We think that he's just repeating for emphasis when he's actually making a key point by using 3 different words. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. Okay? He doesn't say, we cannot dedicate, we cannot dedicate, we cannot dedicate this ground. That would be repeating his point. He uses 3 words that if you look them up in Roget's Thesaurus, they're going to be listed as synonyms. But each one has a slightly different meaning. Okay? What does it mean when we dedicate? What does it mean to dedicate something? Or put another way, when you dedicate something, is it dedicated exclusively to that use? Like if you dedicate a building to, George Washington Elementary School, does that mean that George Washington is the only person that's going to use that elementary school? If you dedicate a book to your wife, does that mean that your wife's the only one who's allowed to read that book? No. No, it just means that you're honoring that person by putting their name on it. So dedication may be exclusive. It may be very open-ended. It may just be a recognition. So dedication is kind of a broad term. And that is really the term he's using. It's the dedication of the National Cemetery. What about consecrate? What does that mean? A lot of blank stares. Okay. Consecrate means to make sacred. All right. Consecrate is what you do to a church or a cemetery normally. You consecrate it, make it sacred, bless it. So this is a little bit more serious than this one. All right. So if you say, I'm dedicating this building as, to say you're starting a church or cemetery. You say, I'm dedicating this building as a church. So, it's kind of like your little, set up your little folding chairs. You can use it as a church, but it's, if somebody wants to repurpose the building as a storefront, they can do that. But if you consecrate it, then that's set aside exclusively for use as a church or a cemetery. And then you have to deconsecrate it in order to, if you want to repurpose it. And here's an interesting one for you. Most people are not going to know this, but hallow. What does it mean to hallow?
Hallowed means holy, but I don't know what to hallow means.
Good. Normally we don't use hallow in the active voice as Lincoln does. Normally when we hear hallow, it's in the passive voice. This is, or it's an adjective, all right? All Hallows Eve, the eve of all saints, all right? Hallowed halls of academia, hallowed ground, all right? It means that it's usually used in the past tense. So the idea is that something is holy or sacred by its own nature, all right? We know the expression at hallowed halls of academia, okay? If you're a university, you can dedicate a building to use as a university. We're taking class online, so we're not currently in a university building. But if we were, especially in a adult ed school, maybe you're at your local campus over by the mall or something, and that office, it's basically an office space being rented by the university, and that building is currently dedicated to use of the university, but it's neither consecrated nor hallowed. Let's say though that your campus is around for a long time. Okay, that campus stays in that one spot for decades, even centuries. All right. After a while, that campus has been used for the university is well established. The campus has been the place where many professors have taught and researched, and where lots of students have learned and gotten their degrees. Then we would start to say it's hallowed. Okay, places like Oxford and Harvard are considered hallowed universities because they're really old and people have been there a long time. All right, so this is usually past tense. This is the key one right here. He brings us in for a reason. All right, again, you have some people who are saying a dedication isn't enough. Other people who are saying the dedication is a consecration in disguise. So what Lincoln says is, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow. Okay? If you think I'm taking away from their deaths, nothing I say or do can detract from it. Nothing you say or do can detract from their deaths. If you think I'm honoring them too much, nothing I say or do can honor them too much. Nothing I say or do can make this land holy. This land is holy because they died here. And nothing we say or do can add or detract from that. All we're doing is putting a name on what they already did. So our first outline would be based on the principles of consecrate, hallow, and dedicate. All right, and those 3 points could be the 3 main points, and we could talk about the issues of First Amendment and whatever objections were being made to this event, either by, again, dishonoring the soldiers or being too religious or not religious enough, and that's why Lincoln uses those 3 phrases in the context. He does the same rhetorical device at the ending. Okay? It says, government of the people. It's a famous phrase. It's coined by Lincoln right here. By the people. For the people. Okay, our next paragraph, our next 5-paragraph essay would have this as its 3 main points. The government of the people, for the people, by the people, shall not perish from the earth. Once again, sounds like he's repeating himself, but he's not. He's using 3 distinct prepositions, and he has a reason for doing that. All right. This one is kind of the most open-ended is a very broad preposition. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to start. What does it mean to have government for the people?
Meaning that its purpose is to serve the people, the
Good.
needs of the people.
Thanks. Government for the people is government in the people's interest. What does it mean to have government by the people?
The people are either the government or have some direct say in the government.
Good. People have a say in the government. And what does it mean to have government? With these two ruled out, what does it mean to have government of the people? Because a lot of people initially say it means the same thing as this, but I don't think he means that. What does it mean to have government of the people?
I'm not sure.
It means to have government, period. To govern the people. Okay? So every government has at least one of these criteria, but only one government in history has successfully had all of them. Alright? The conventional wisdom of political philosophy was that government by the people is never government for the people. The democracy always fails when the people elect a dictator because he promises them the things they want to hear, or they vote themselves too much money out of the public treasury and bankrupt this country, or else they vote away too many of the regulations of society and society devolves into chaos. So historically, one of those three things has always happened every time there's been a democracy. Either the people have said, we're going to do away with all the rules, so they end up with anarchy, or they've said, there's some guy comes along who has a lot of money and a lot of smooth talk and convinces them to elect him, and he turns out to be a dictator, or else they vote themselves largesse out of the public treasury, as the expression goes, and they bankrupt themselves. So this one has never been successful in history, because it rarely happens it never actually governs the people. Usually when people govern themselves, they govern for themselves, but maybe not necessarily in their own best interest, but they don't often necessarily govern themselves. You may have a good monarchy, okay? A monarchy is government of the people, and a good monarch will govern for the people, but obviously a monarchy is not government by the people, all right? So the United States, which is only 7 years, it's 87 years, and that's talking about since the Declaration of Independence, since the beginning of the Revolution. The United States has only been around for 87 years since the Declaration of Independence. That's not talking about the Constitution, which is even more, about a decade more recent than that. So, as young as it was in the history of countries, it's also the oldest representative democracy in the history of the world. So, in the 87 years since, there's been the French Revolution, there have been other revolutions in Europe. Other people have tried to establish representative democracies like the U.S. has, and they failed. So Lincoln is saying that one of the desperate issues of this war is not just even the issues of the country itself, but whether they can prove that representative democracy works. Because if this war fails, if the Union fails, then it proves that representative democracy doesn't work, and all those old political philosophers who said democracy always fails are just going to be proven right again. Let's get back to another point that Lincoln makes here, when he's emphasizing the importance of this cause, and then we'll go to our third paragraph, our third essay. An important term in creative writing and literary criticism is what we call a governing metaphor. What is a metaphor? All right, you should all have a basic idea of what a metaphor is. What's a metaphor?
Direct comparison between two things.
Okay. A metaphor is symbolic language where you refer to something, a simile is uses like or as. A metaphor just says it. That guy is a regular Hercules. That woman is a regular Venus. Okay, you're not saying it's like, you're actually directly, symbolically connecting the two things. A governing metaphor is a technique where a writer, when they're putting together a work, tries to embody their theme by using some kind of symbol that they carry throughout the work. All right. For example, I once did notes for a program on a concert, and I used the governing metaphor of a tapestry. And so whenever I wanted to use a little bit of symbolic language or an adjective or whatever, I tried to use adjectives and allusions and symbols that connected to the idea of tapestry. Okay, they used colors or sewing or whatever metaphors throughout the work. All right. Lincoln has a governing metaphor here, which he's trying to use to emphasize the desperation of the cause. I want you to look at this point by point. All right. Nation conceived, dedicated. All right. Fathers. Endure. Live. That this nation might live. Goes on, and at the bottom, shall not perish. What is the governing metaphor of this speech? Conceived, dedicated, fathers, endure, live, perish. What's he comparing our nation to?
To birth or a new person?
A baby. He's saying our country is a sick little baby. Because we're an infant in the grand scheme of things as nations go. And he's saying, he's pulling on people's emotions by comparing the nation to a little baby that is sick. And if this baby dies, there'll never be another one like it. Okay? So we have to keep the baby alive. So let's look at those things, and let's get back to the three main issues of the Civil War, and we'll talk about the other, probably the coolest of the things. And this is where we get into the concept of allusion. All right, remember that an allusion is a reference. Okay. For example, the example I just gave. All right, if you say a man is a regular Hercules, you mean he's strong. All right. Allusions have like any metaphor or any symbolic language. Allusions have a direct, obvious meaning. However, what we literary critics do is we look at allusions and we wonder if they have something else to say. Okay, so if I say that fellow's a regular Hercules, I might be complimenting him on his strength or his handsomeness or something. I might be subtly insulting him by saying he thinks he's a god. Okay, if you have a reference to, it's kind of popular. There's a song, from the 60s, I think, where the singer sings about Romeo and Juliet, Samson and Delilah. Well, those are kind of negative relationships to compare your relationship to young teenagers who commit suicide and a woman who seduces a guy into breaking his vows and cutting his hair off so he loses all his strength and dies. Those aren't exactly positive relationships to be referencing. And so maybe that singer has a slight subtext going on there. Okay, that's the kind of thing we literary critics go on. So Lincoln uses an allusion in this speech, and if you know the background of the allusion, he's saying a lot more than he appears to be saying. All right, and on the one hand, we may have to hunt in our day and age, but the knowledge that he's referring to, he's expecting people to have. All right, he's expecting that at least an educated person of his day is going to know this stuff. And that's the other thing that happens, of course. When people write things, this day and age, you see allusions all the time. You may not realize it, okay? A popular television show might use allusions, and it's using allusions to current events in popular culture. Right? Some shows do that more than others. I remember, I was a big fan of Murphy Brown when it was on, okay? That show uses a lot of allusions. And even watching the show in reruns a couple of years after they originally aired, they already seemed dated. Okay, it was using a lot of references to current people who were famous or news stories or whatever. That when the show aired, everybody knew and was talking about. But a couple of years later, you might forget who that person was or whatever. So imagine, decades or centuries later, people forget this. That's the purpose of being educated. Okay, the more you know, the better you get the allusions in different people's writings. The better you get the references. Took a class in post-1815 French history, post-Napoleon French history. I kind of took it because one of those cases where I took it because I needed an upper division history class, and it was fit my schedule and everything. It wasn't something that particularly interested me. But there are a lot of terms in political philosophy that come from French history. So taking that French history course, I learned a lot that I wouldn't have otherwise known. So when I saw different names in other classes, I knew who they were. All right. So that's why you're supposed to, again, that's one of the reasons it's important to have a broad curriculum. So let's talk about the passage in question. Back to the beginning of the speech. This nation is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. All right. Question number 1. And let's not get into the question of men, women side of it. Though actually women are going to come back with a vengeance in this part of the lesson. Question number 1. Why does Lincoln say this in the speech? Shouldn't take any response. Why is Lincoln telling us that the nation is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal?
To refer back to the Declaration of Independence? Or?
Not yet. Why is he directly using that? What's the point he's making in the speech? What's the face value point he's making in the speech? Why is he telling us that our nation was dedicated to the principle that all men are created equal?
To refer to the issue of slavery?
Right, to refer to the issue of slavery. To say that slavery is wrong, okay? It violates the very principle on which our country is founded. Right, that's what most people read when they say this. Now, he's also quoting. As I said, he's making an allusion here. And so again, when we see a quotation or an allusion, we literary scholars look at it and say, I wonder what else is here. If I go back to the original source that they're quoting or alluding to, what else might it tell me about the context? So, all men are created equal. Some of you may have already thought of this. What is he directly quoting?
Declaration of Independence?
Good, the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, okay? Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. Lincoln could have said all sorts of things to open up a speech, okay? If he wanted to quote the founding principles of our country, could have quoted the preamble to the Constitution, could have quoted, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness out of the Declaration of Independence. He could have quoted, any number of documents by the founding fathers. He could have quoted all sorts of things. Or if he wanted to make a statement against slavery, again, he could have quoted all sorts of statements against slavery. But he chose this particular phrase, and I think he has a reason to. Because what we're going to see in our third outline is that he can address the 3 main issues of the war with this one little phrase, by the use of allusion, by playing on the fact that he expects you to have the background knowledge of this. First thing is Declaration of Independence. He says, our nation was founded on the proposition that all men are created equal. Our nation was founded on the Declaration of Independence. Let's get back to that question I asked at the beginning of the lesson about the purpose, the main reason for the war. Okay, the main thing they're fighting for is who has the right to interpret the Constitution, the federal government or the states. States' rights. Now, the idea for states' rights was that originally, the 13 colonies were all founded as separate colonies of England, and they were all founded for slightly different reasons. Some of them were founded for religious freedom, some were founded for economic freedom, some were founded for a place for England to send their prisoners. Okay? And they had different reasons they were founded, and they had slightly different styles of government, and they operated as sovereign units. Okay? Sovereign means self-governing. When they decided collectively that they wanted to pool their resources and overthrow England because they had common grievances, their original idea was that they were going to team up and be what's called a federation, right, or a confederation. They were going to be a group of sovereign entities, sovereign states, that would team up for dealing with how they would deal with each other and how they would deal with the rest of the world. That's why they were the United States of America and not the United State of America, because they were going to be different states. So their original government they came up with, the original document that they threw together to give them the terms of their alliance after they began revolting against England were called the Articles of Confederation. All right, and the Articles of Confederation, a lot of the things that later appear in the Constitution appear in it, and some things that appear in it are changed by the Constitution. But the Articles of Confederation were our first government. Okay, but they realized it wasn't good enough, and it was still only intended as a short-term fix. So they can put together the Constitution after the war was over to give a more solid government. Now, the Articles of Confederation had given the states the right to pull out of the Confederacy, the Federation, if they wanted to. Okay, the Union, whatever you want to call it at the time. The states, if they wanted to pull away from the United States, could absolutely do that under the Articles of Confederation. Some states didn't like the fact that the Constitution had no such provision. So several of the states, ironically most of them northern states, New York is often given as an example of this, when they ratified the Constitution, they said, we're ratifying the Constitution, but we reserve the right to secede from the Union if the Union should ever do something we seriously disagree with. So, when the issue of slavery became a national issue, and the problem with slavery, besides the fact that it was evil, was that a lot of people agreed that slavery was wrong. You know, most of the founding fathers realized they were hypocrites for saying all men are created equal and having slaves. But as with some moral issues today, people felt that it was an unpleasant reality of life that you just had to put up with. Okay, that you can, the economy was based on it. People depended on it for their freedom of choice and all those kinds of things. So, as with a lot of moral issues that are debated today, people thought that slavery was inevitable and there was no way to stop it. And if you ended it, all heck would break loose in society. So, but something else happened, okay? The early colonists had really, when they came to the United States, they saw it as carte blanche to do whatever they want. And they had really kind of trashed the Eastern Seaboard. We talk about environmental issues today. They had environmental issues back then. In fact, Benjamin Franklin was one of the first formal environmentalists. And they pretty much trashed the Eastern Seaboard. And they made the land very unarable. That's why the movement west later on was important. So they were running out of land that they could do stuff with agriculturally, and they needed crops that they could grow in very shallow ground. Cotton was not a very profitable crop. It was profitable in its own way when it was rare, and but the only kind of cotton that produces it of itself fluently has to grow in very moist soil. So cotton was really big in the coastal areas like Charleston, but the kind of cotton that grows inland isn't as fruitful as the kind of cotton that grows by the sea. And so cotton had never really, it was kind of just a luxury. Then the invention of the cotton gin allowed for two things. It allowed for them to manufacture things out of cotton more easily than they had in the past. It also managed them to take cotton plants that were less plentiful and make more cotton out of them. So with the rise of the cotton gin, slavery, I'll make a little map here of South Carolina, for example. It's a very bad replica of South Carolina's shape, but bear with me. I'm not a geographer. All right, so let's say this is Charleston down here in Beaufort and those areas. Okay, there were lots of slaves down for most of history up till really just the 1830s or 40s. There were lots of slaves down here where they were growing cotton, rice, and tea, and up here in the upcountry were mostly just little subsistence farmers. And these subsistence farmers were pretty much, again, milking their land dry. It was getting harder and harder for them to grow food crops. So when the cotton gin was developed, suddenly these subsistence farmers could grow inland cotton that wasn't as bountiful as the cotton down here, but they could make a profit off of it by putting it to the cotton gin and getting a lot of cotton out of some sparse plants. And suddenly they started buying slaves. So you notice that between the 1790s, right around the time of the Revolution, most of even the state of South Carolina was abolitionist, and then by the 1840s, most of them were pro-slavery. So meanwhile, up north, the Industrial Revolution was going on. The northern industrialists and bankers were finding less need of slaves because of the Industrial Revolution, because of cheap labor coming in from European immigrants. so they didn't really need slaves the way the Southerners did. Okay, so slavery had become a regional issue because the Industrial Revolution, the waves of European immigrants were making slavery less of an economic necessity in the North, while the cotton gin and the nature of Southern agriculture at the time had made slavery more "quote unquote" necessary in the South for these, particularly for these upcountry small-time farmers to be able to afford to profitably farm on their very shallow soil. All right, so when it became a regional issue, we had the abolitionists wanting to outlaw it across the country, and other people who said, well, let's try to take it in stages, and other people who didn't want it at all. So they started making different compromises and stuff. In the early 1850s, the Whig Party, which was the anti-slavery party, had control of the government under Millard Fillmore. Was president at the time. He was a Whig. He ran for president, promising to outlaw slavery. And while he was president, he didn't really push any measures to outlaw slavery. And the infamous Dred Scott decision, which said that slavery was constitutional, went through the Supreme Court under his watch. So people said, hey, those Whigs are lying to us. The Whigs at the time were made up of the abolitionists, who were Christian evangelicals, and as well as the Northeastern bankers. And then the Democrats at the time were the pro-slavery party in the South. And when the Whigs failed to outlaw slavery, the Whig Party fell apart, and the rich industrialists who were in the Whig Party joined the Democratic Party, and the Christians took a while to form their own party, but they formed a new party called the GOP, the Grand Old Party, or the Republicans, okay, in the 1860s. So in the 1860 election, the Democrats split into Northern and Southern, both pro-slavery organizations, but and the Republicans came in on a strictly anti-slavery platform and won. All right, in a three-way split. Okay, so Lincoln quotes the Declaration of Independence. The whole debate about states' rights comes about because those Articles of Confederation, a man named John C. Calhoun in South Carolina, who was vice president under Andrew Jackson, Calhoun developed this theory called nullification. And his theory was that since the Articles of Confederation required the states to, or allowed the states to secede, and since those states, some of the states when they signed the Constitution reserved the right to secede, but since the Constitution did not specifically mention it either way, that anything that the Articles said that the Constitution did not say, the Articles should still apply. So he said that the states had the right to nullify the Constitution and go by the Articles of Confederation. So given that knowledge, why is Lincoln referring to the Declaration of Independence specifically?
Not sure.
Because he's saying that, okay, you want to say that the Articles of Confederation trump the Constitution? Well, even if you accept the Articles of Confederation, you are still, by implication, accepting the Declaration of Independence.
Okay.
And the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. All right. So far, with his illusion, he has answered the question of slavery itself by saying all men are created equal, and he's addressed the question of states' rights, saying, well, you can have your states' rights, but you still have to outlaw slavery because if you want to argue the Articles of Confederation, then you have to accept the Declaration of Independence. All right. Third point in our 5-paragraph essay is Thomas Jefferson did not coin the phrase all men are created equal. He's quoting someone else. Who is Thomas Jefferson quoting? Where does the phrase all men are created equal originate?
Thomas Hobbes? Is that what you mean?
Okay. Of course, the audience in this demonstration has heard the lesson before. A lot of times when students hear this question, their first answer is the Bible. Okay. If anything, the Bible says that all men are not created equal. Okay, the Bible kind of talks about chosen people and all that kind of stuff. But the concept of all men are created equal is derived from the Bible. The phrase all men are created equal is first found in a book called Leviathan by a man named Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was one of a group of people known as the social contract philosophers. Social contract philosophers were a group of philosophers in the 17th and 18th centuries who said that society is a social contract, all right? That people get together and they agree to establish government. And what these guys did was, as Europeans were coming through America and encountering different Native American groups, and of course at this point they were starting to explore parts of Africa that they really hadn't had contact with since the Roman era, and they were exploring parts of Asia in depth. And they learned about these societies that they considered uncivilized or savage or whatever. And so, and in some sense, the definition of civilization is to have a permanent city. So a lot of these societies were actually uncivilized in the literal sense of meaning. But what they wanted to do is they said, well, these people don't have government. They did have government. They just didn't have government as the Westerners understood it. And they said, what is a society like without government? And so some of them would hear, oh, the Native Americans they scout people and they torture and kill and they eat people's hearts and stuff like that. And then other people would hear, oh, they're peaceful little wonderful people who sit around smoking peace pipes all the time. You know, the same stereotypes of Native Americans that have come down to today existed back then. And so Hobbes was one of the people who listened to the negative stereotypes of Native Americans. He also grew up under a period called the British Civil War in the early 1600s, when Parliament and the King were at war with each other and different factions were arguing over which kind of Protestantism should run England. So Hobbes grew up in the British Civil War. He heard all these reports about savage Native Americans, and he developed a famous idea that life in the state of nature, that is life without government, is solitary, cruel, brutish, and short. The perpetual war of all against all for all. That the natural right, the natural law is kill or be killed. The natural right is the right of every person to every. If I see it, it's mine, and I can have it. South Central LA and the Balkans are the natural state of man, according to Thomas Hobbes. You see something, you kill somebody else to get it. All right. Hobbes' theory is that people perpetually fight. Okay, think about gangs. Okay, gangs have their territories, right? As long as the gangs stay in their territories and don't traipse other people's territories, they don't have gang wars. But if this gang member goes over that gang member's territory, then they have a gang war. And so even gangs, Somali warlords and stuff can set rules, because they start to realize that it doesn't make sense to be constantly fighting for stuff. All right, at some point you have to stop living in constant. You want to stop living in constant fear and constant struggle, and enjoy the things that you've killed other people to get. So even in the state of nature, says Hobbes, people will eventually say, hey, we want something called peace. And they establish a social contract to set the terms for peace, where they sacrifice some of their rights for others. All right? I've kind of actually gotten ahead. Let me go back a bit to the phrase all men are created equal. So why does Hobbes say all men are created equal? Because this is where the Bible actually comes in. Everybody familiar with the story of Deborah, or the story of Judith, or the story of Esther? Okay, well, Esther doesn't kill the king, but Deborah, in the book of Judges, she seduces the enemy king, and while he's asleep in bed, she picks up a rock and bashes his brains in with a rock. And Judith, in the book of Judith, seduces the enemy king and cuts his head off while he sleeps. And Esther doesn't kill the enemy king, but she does seduce him, and the guy who works for him, who wants to kill the Israelites, Esther becomes queen and talks the king into killing his right-hand man who wants to kill all the Jews. So Hobbes says that all men are created equal because the weakest can kill the strongest. We are all made equal in death. It doesn't matter how rich you are, how powerful you are, how healthy you are, whatever, how strong you are, somebody can murder you. And not only somebody, but the weakest, frailest little girl in the world can murder you by teaming up with other people or deceiving you or seducing you or whatever. So that's why Hobbes says all men are created equal. It's not as grandiose an ideal as it has come down to be. So, again, Hobbes' whole point is that people have to sacrifice some rights for others. So let's get back to the Civil War. What's going on? We're having this war over the claim that Southerners have the right to secede from the Union and that Southerners have the right to keep slaves. Lincoln, as we've seen, has made this grand appeal for the survival of this infant nation, which is representing an ideal not just for the nation itself, for the whole world. We're the first democracy to last this long in history, and we want to last longer. And so he's saying, by evoking Thomas Hobbes indirectly, he's saying, well, I want you Southerners to, invoking the social contract. The Constitution is a social contract. Signed it. When you sign a social contract, just as Hobbes says, you agreed to give up some of your rights for the sake of peace. And I want you to relinquish those rights so we can have peace. And therefore, with that one phrase, all men are created equal, Lincoln is addressing the issue of slavery, the issue of states' rights, and the issue of the Civil War itself. See? That's why when you know a lot about different history and vocabulary and cultural references and stuff, you can say a lot in a few words by packing in the right references. It's also how when your teacher tells you to do an essay, a critical essay on a piece of literature or a small passage, you can write a lot about a small passage if you know enough to know what the writer's talking about in their metaphors and allusions and stuff, and pull out the different meanings that are at play there. Thank you.